So I'm here to talk about having a dual practice, and but the title of my talk actually points to some of the actual physical difficulties in certain instances of having a dual practice, which is that it's actually quite hard to toggle back and forth between showing images, readings, etc. So you'll forgive me if at certain points, my brain has to switch to remembering to do something. I am going to show you there will be images up, which I may refer to, but I'm not giving an artist's talk. I'm going to focus more on my writing, but talk about some of the conditions of doing both. So the first thing that I would say, and I will do one of the toggling bits, is that I was an artist for 15 years before I started to write and to publish. So that was the primary identity. And, but somewhat confusingly, during that time period, and in fact for a lot of my art life, but certainly during the period where I was just an artist, writing was the image in my work, my handwriting. It was a way of representing self, a kind of indexical trace of the self rather than having a picture of myself, which is how I had started out. And the book actually was a major image in my work. And what I was motivated by ultimately was the idea that women were filled with language, which I felt as a young woman was not what people thought about women. Women were thought of for their appearance, their beauty, but the idea that they were filled with language was something else, yet that was my experience. So what made me decide to go from one identity to two identities and start to decide to write an essay and start to publish and change my life? Before I answer the question, I should say that in some ways I was primed to be an artist. I was primed to be an artist because my parents were artists and I lived within the New York art world. But in a way I was also primed to be a writer due to two important influences. The first one is that I'm a first-generation American. My parents were refugees, and for them, English was their fourth language, maybe. So I think it's very traditional that first-generation Americans are the speakers for their parents. In this case, my sister and I were, in a way, the metaphorical speakers and the political speakers for our parents, who were both very articulate in their way, but they certainly were not as articulate in English as they would have been if they could speak in the language in which they had learned to think. And so they were hampered in their ability fully to integrate and be effective in American culture. Further than that, my mother was very political, and I would say that she had a kind of activist substructure, and whenever she perceived an injustice, she would say, somebody should write an article. So she had a strong Middle European accent. Well, who was going to write an article but me and my sister? That's what we're going to do. And I think that another point of her saying that was it showed her political impulses, but it also showed her respect for the printed word. I have to say that if my sister and I had ever published in the New Yorker, she would have been over the moon in a way that all of our accomplishments didn't quite hit that. That really would have done it. The other major influence was my involvement with feminism. And at the age of 21, I decided to join the feminist art program when I went to graduate school. And there were a couple of things that I feel that were really deeply ingrained in us in the program. And Faith Wilding is here, who is also in the program with me. One of them was that if the mainstream discourse did not accept what you did, or in fact denigrated it, ignored it, whatever, you had to create your own discourse. You had to have your own curatorial practices, your own critical practices. So it was very important to take command, and of course writing was a very important factor in that. The other thing is I was involved, because I had a little bit of art historical training as an undergrad. I was sort of, I don't quite remember the details, but I was kind of delegated to being in the art history section of the feminist program. And in a way, you know, we're talking 1971. It's the beginning of the development of something called art history, you know, that there were women artists, and then finding out who they were and getting pictures of their work. And one of the things that I learned, I'd already kind of learned this as an art history major period, but then certainly in the context of feminism, was that it wasn't only important to have done the work and for the work to have survived the centuries, survived misattributions, etc., but it was really important to have left some sort of written trace, if there was something written about you or if you had written it yourself. So one of the things that stands out in my mind is that the 18th century French painter Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun in the 19th century wrote a kind of tell-all Lena Dunham kind of autobiography, and it was very helpful. She was a very good painter, but it also was very helpful to kind of create a character for herself and keep her in discourse, in history. So those were all things that were in the back of my mind, and I think that I had, I guess I think I knew I could write, but I had to have a reason, and the reason came in the early 80s. The provocation and the catalyst were paintings by someone I had gone to school with, namely the artist David Salle. And in the early 80s were a very transformative period. Everything that you had ever believed in during the 60s and 70s were literally like turned on their head. And so there was a lot of adaptation that had to take place in that decade if you had come of age earlier. And his work, in a way, represented that to me, and particularly his representations of women. I decided not to put any of those up because I don't see why I should mess up my talk with his work, but he's well known enough that you can look at it. And the thing is that when I saw the work in the, like 82, I thought, this work, I know this work, he wasn't doing that work when he was a student, but I understood that work in a historical context that no one else did, which is that I knew that he had been a student when the feminist art program was a very important part of a major avant-garde art school. Therefore, I thought his images were a reaction formation to feminism, and also they were totally knowing. I mean, it's not like he was unconscious of the effect that his work would have. So basically, I just decided to write an essay. And it was very strange. I went to the library and researched somebody that I'd gone to school with, and I learned how to write an essay, which I had never done anything like that. And it took me about 2 years and a lot of editing from friends. And then the essay had a very interesting history of rejection from major art journals, including October and Art in America, and I don't even remember some of the others. And so I decided with another painter, Susan B., to start our own art magazine, which was, of course, totally feminist thing to do. It was like, we couldn't get in one door, so we, built another door. And our magazine meaning was it was a feminist magazine, but we published men as well as women. It wasn't all about feminism. We were also interested in some of the other aspects of what was happening in the 80s. And the reason we chose meaning was that the belief in meaning was completely turned over. You did not have a belief in meaning. It was the era of irony. On the other hand, we felt the need to bracket the word ourselves with what they're called the slashes, the virgules is what they're called. So I'm going to read just teeny bits. The other thing about having a dual practice and a dual talk is that actually reading takes a phenomenal amount of time, much more than you think. But I thought I'd read the beginning, and then a teeny little bit more of the essay, Appropriated Sexuality, which was my first essay. It's the first essay in my book, Wet. And I'll start even with the epigraphs, because the entire thing was sort of like this essay is when I opened the door in the front of the stage and walked out onto the stage and entered a public life. I didn't quite realize it when I did it, but nevertheless, that was what happened. So the essay is Appropriated Sexuality. Whoever despises the clitoris despises the penis. Whoever despises the penis despises the cunt. Whoever despises the cunt despises the life of the child. Muriel Rukeyser. Rapists make better artists. Carolyn Donahue, David Sally, Joan Wallace. A woman lies on her back, holding her knees to her stomach. She has no face. She is only a cunt, buttocks, and a foot, toes tensed as if to indicate pain or sexual excitement or both. A patterned cloth shape is superimposed over her, and paint-tipped pegs protrude from the wooden picture plane above her. Thus, she is dominated by phallic representations. This image of woman in David Sally's The Disappearance of the Booming Voice from 1984 may be appropriated from mass media pornography, but more immediately, it's based on a photograph taken by Sally himself. Sally has said that what's compelling about pornography is knowing that someone did it. It's not just seeing what you're presented with, but knowing that someone set it up for you to see. And that the great thing about pornography is that something has been photographed. Sally has even suggested that the photography was invented for the enhancement of pornography. But, cries critic Robert Pincus Witten, clearly your works must be liberated from the false charges of pornography. And that was pretty much what would happen, is that male critics would write about the work, they would raise the issue of pornography, and then immediately say, no, that this work is not pornographic, it's not about that. So then I picked up on it and said, but the issue of misogyny is left untouched. Yet it is the pervasive misogyny of Sally's depiction of woman that is so persistently refuted and excused in favor of a, quote, wider possibility of discussion for, quote, in literature of 20th century art, the sexist bias, itself unmentionable, is covered up and approved by the insistence on other meanings. Sally's depiction of woman is discussed in terms of the deconstruction of the meaning of imagery and in terms of art historical references to chiaroscuro, Leonardo, modernism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, Goya, Jasper Johns, Derrida, and Lacan, you name it, anything but the obvious. The explicit misogyny of Sally's images of woman is matched by the implicit misogyny of its acceptance by many critics. This complicity is clearly stated by Pincus Witten. We're commodifying the object and we're mythifying the makers. I've certainly participated, this is still his quote, I've certainly participated in that mechanism because I believe in the mechanism. And in this essay, I feel like I discovered my own mechanism or my own methodology of writing, which I adhered to for quite a number of years, which is to take an image, to read it closely and compare it to what was being said, not so much by the artists themselves, though sometimes I would do that, but by critics, and then intervene into that with my analysis of what the critics were saying or what it meant, what they were doing, as well as bringing in other texts that might not be brought to bear on that discussion. And I'll just read the last line of the essay. I've described a painting which has a kind of reference to Lee Harvey Oswald. We see in this, and of course a woman in some sort of humiliating position. We see in this one painting a conflation of Sally's humiliation of woman, his glamorization and martyrdom of the assassin artist as he links woman, death, and paint. A vicarious suicide, David Sally savages woman rather than savage himself. This is considered appropriate sexuality, and it is a source of his market value. So I entered the door with a bang. And the most satisfying moment for me was when an art historian, Carol Duncan, who was a marvelous feminist art historian who I'd never met and admired, called me up on the phone in the days where people looked you up in a book, to find the name, and said, "Who are you?" And I'm like, oh, that's so great. I'd like to read a little bit by another essay, which is another instance of my taking on a critical field. It's an essay called Figureground, which is one of the most complex essays that I've written, I think, ever. I don't think I would be able to write this essay now in terms of the kind of research that I brought together. And when I reread it, there are parts of it where I think I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but it sounds really interesting. And so significantly, I lost my teaching notes to it years ago, where I really had all the annotations of everything, and I was never able to reconstruct them. So, Figureground, this is from 1989. Some people live by what they see with their eyes: light, darkness, color, form. Painters are compelled to express this continuous act of seeing and looking through the application of a liquid or viscous matter on a two-dimensional surface. Despite a barrage of criticism of painting and of representation, even painters who are cognizant or complicit with this critique continue their preoccupation. I am one of those retinal individuals. Criticism of the practice of painting, emerging from a curious blend of modernist idealism and Marxism, may be found in October, or the book Art After Modernism, Rethinking Representation. While I am reluctant to give this loosely generalized school of criticism a name, aesthetic terrorism might describe its adherents' fundamental, and here it's all quotes from text, fundamental commitment to the primacy of objectivity and their use of exclusion as one of their principal creative means. In this discourse on art, painting has been described as peripheral, vestigial, an atavistic production mode, and a dysfunctional plastic category, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, painting continues. If painting needs defending from these criticisms and from the paintings that may present justifiable targets for such a critique, what method is most effective for a painter to pursue? I will momentarily defer from resorting to the transcendent, utopian, heroic statement of belief commonly preferred by painters as the ultimate defense of painting. For to argue the validity of painting on the ground of belief is a your word against mine proposition. That is, your word against my work. On the ground of words, painting stands to be handicapped, often because a certain critical approach may have already devalorized an entire vocabulary. Another strategy for the painter, then, is to examine the critic's words, or perhaps for the imaginary to re-audit the symbolic order. So again, sort of declaring my method. And then I always describe this as the sort of money shot of the essay, Figureground. So I'll just read that part. The desire for an art from which belief, emotion, spirit, and psyche would be vacated, an art that would be pure, architectural, that would dispense with the wetness of figure. Marcel Duchamp calls for a completely dry drawing, a dry conception of art, may find a source in a deeply rooted fear of liquidity, of viscousness, of goo. Whose goo is feared may emerge from a reading of male fantasies, Klaus Thewelite's analysis of members of the German Freikorps, mercenary soldiers who put down worker rebellions and fought border disputes in the years between the end of World War I and the advent of the Third Reich. The soldier male, quote, according to Thewelite's term, has never fully developed a, quote, secure sense of external boundaries, a pleasurable sense of the membrane of skin. He fears the red floods of the masses, blood, dirt, morass, slime, pulp, woman, which he perceives as constantly threatening to dissolve his external boundaries. He also fears the liquid forces insecurely caged within his own body, interiors, and unconscious. The soldier male resolves these conflictual fears by the construction of a militarized, regimented body, by incorporation into a desexualized phalanx of men, and by the reduction through killing of all outer threats back to the red pulp he imagines every living thing to be. Against the unregimented flow of paint, some critics posit the mechanistic one of architecture or of language. This was quite a strong attack on October. I mean, I think it was a strong attack on October, and particularly on Benjamin Buchloh, who happened to be a friend, or had been a friend of mine. You can see from both these essays that I made friends and I made a life from doing these writings, but I also attacked powerful people, and that did not necessarily serve me. But luckily, I wasn't really focused on that. In other words, I didn't really realize that I was risking anything by doing writing in this way. And luckily, I feel like people are not courageous on purpose. They're courageous by default. In other words, I'm the most risk-averse person you could imagine. I don't ride a bicycle. I don't want to do anything where I might hurt myself. But on the other hand, I'll get up in the morning and attack like the most powerful critic at the time. But there's something I wanted to talk about, which is something that I wrote about several years later, which I called the white list, which is that the way that this kind of attack is dealt with is different than the blacklist, where you're simply, you're not allowed to make a living, your name is literally in a list of not employable. But the fact is that the best way is to ignore something. And that is a lot of what happened. My David Salle piece was never mentioned in the press until 2002, so almost 20 years later, in a review of something else that I had done. It's never quoted, to my knowledge. And in articles about David Salle, the most people will say is, some feminists say, and they never say Mira Schor said, which would give me importance in some sense, or power. And similarly, all the writings that I've done about painting, October, not paying attention. And I think that what power doesn't answer, my joke is like the gods don't answer. But I actually am quite interested in power. I felt that feminism, my definition of feminism is that it's a gendered critique of power. And I'm not interested in acquiring power for myself. I'm interested in looking at people who have arrogated power to themselves. I don't fully understand how they do it, but it's interesting to write about that. So I wrote a lot over a decade, and published in Meaning, and within 4 years of Appropriated Sexuality, one of my texts was the cover essay of Art Forum. So it was much easier to enter into the field of writing about art than it was as an artist. And I had written a piece about Ida Appelbrug. I was very proud of it. It was on the cover, which is a very deeply held secret because it's actually something that people can speculate on financially. So even the artist doesn't know about it until the day of publication, at least in those days. I walked in, I thought, wow, I'm on the cover of Art Forum. And then I thought, no, but I'm not on the cover of Art Forum. And that's been an issue. I think all painters who write, all artists who write, but particularly all painters who write, have certain issues about being a writer. And when I was a student, I wasn't really aware that a lot of the people that I knew or admired, whether I knew them or not, I admired them, that they were writers also. I studied, or I knew Alan Kaprow, I was friends with Jack Tworkov, I admired the work of Barnett Newman, and I had no idea that they were very important writers, very good and important writers. But as I started to research what they had to say, then I found that most of these people, if they were given a chance or asked, would say that writing was like the biggest. Robert Motherwell, who was also a good writer, said it was the greatest tragedy that had ever, befell his career. And the reason for that is because in some way you're held, as a painter, again, in particular, as opposed to a conceptual artist or a sculptor, you're held suspect. In some way you're a threat, and for critics, and therefore you're told, you're literally told to your face that you can't possibly be doing both equally or care about both equally, so you really have to decide. And so it's like a Sophie's choice, that is given to you. Which child do you want to give away? And your work risks being seen as an illustration of your ideas in your art, in your writing. And nevertheless, I continued. And it was a very interesting decade of the 80s. It was a very contentious intellectual decade. And writing, I found, actually sharpened my approach to my own painting, because in some sense, it's not that I was applying my critique to my own painting. It's more that I had immersed myself in ideas that affected my painting. I returned after a little sort of vacation back to representing language. But this time it was the language in a sense of theory, which was my still life object, and it was appropriated language. So I was also affected by the ideas that I had to learn. And I was learning these things out of, long past school. The essays that I'd written in that decade, mid-'80s to mid-'90s, were collected in a book called Wet. And in terms of this dual identity of painter and writer, it was a big deal for Duke University Press that my artwork, the writer's artwork, would be on the cover. They had a meeting about it. And I just insisted, to me it made total sense that nobody else's work could possibly be on it. I just didn't, and so I documented this painting, Slit of Paint, and sent a close-up image. And of course it turned out to be a very popular cover. It helped sell the book, and I think it's helped sort of people remembered it. And in fact, Jen, in her review of the book, talked about what it meant to be a young woman sitting in a cafe reading this book so that the image was visible to other people. And by the time I wrote my second book and presented them with the cover art, then by that time they were copacetic with it. So I had not set out to write Wet, a book. I had just written and then I accumulated enough. But now I decided, instead of just what many artist writers have done, which is the writing is meant to be like a little career lifeboat that gets you like from the island to the shore, as it were, and then you have a successful career and you don't have time to write anymore and you don't really need to, et cetera. Unfortunately, my career didn't work out that way, and I still had things to say. And in fact, I liked the challenge of trying to conceive of a book totally, and played kind of three-dimensional chess for several years with essays. In the end, the book is not dissimilar to Wet. I cover the same general subjects of feminism, painting, and teaching. And it is a collection of essays, but there was a little bit more of a structure to it. And I don't know what time it is, so I don't know whether I may skip actually reading from it and go back to it perhaps a little bit later. But when I was finished with the book and working on the introduction, I had to explain. Duke is that my editor really that puts a lot of emphasis on the introduction, because it's meant as a teaching device. What is in this book? What is this book about? And A Decade of Negative Thinking was actually a very difficult book to coagulate in some sense. Ultimately, I decided that in some way it was about relationships to the past, reworkings, appropriations, misreadings, hauntings, etc. But I also had to say why at the very last minute I changed the working title to the final title, A Decade of Negative Thinking. Was I a negative thinker? So no, I'm not a negative thinker. And I really had in mind the political events of the years 2000s, which is when I was writing it. So it was like Vice President Cheney was the negative thinker, not me. But still, I started to think about, like, well, what would I have written if I were not addressing certain critical issues or historical concerns? And so then I came up with the idea of doing a blog that would be called A Year of Positive Thinking. I'm just going to shift through a number of paintings that, just to say that some of the paintings end up being sort of about art. This is actually the first line of a major essay on called Modest Painting. And this is a more recent painting which sets out some of the conditions of contemporary practice. And then I've been doing these topsy-turvy paintings, which also are reversible paintings, which also in some way speak to this dual identity. And yeah, so this is another topsy-turvy. And this drawing, which is sort of the entrance of the figure back into my work, became the little icon of my blog, A Year of Positive Thinking. And this is the About page, which is just this isn't a live image, but we're going to switch to the blog itself. And there are a couple of things to talk about in terms of switching from essays to a blog, which I think are very indicative of the time that we're in now, and also perhaps my own personality at a different age, which is when I began to write, I felt that I had to write at a certain level to manifest an ability to use a certain vocabulary and refer to certain texts, so that I would be taken at least marginally seriously by the people who I was addressing and quoting and critiquing. And I think that was great, but in a way, was it truly myself? I'll never really know. It's something that I ask myself now, and certainly I never convinced them, as far as, because I never could use the language completely naturally. Like my parents speaking English, theory language was a little bit like an acquired language later in life. It wasn't totally intrinsic. And the other thing is writing an essay, I would have an idea, I would spend maybe a year or 2 years writing, researching the essay, polishing the essay. I had a lot more time. And there are two things I would say. I was younger, and there was no internet when I first started writing. And that's very significant, because it's not only that the internet has changed the form of writing, it's that it's changed how we use our time, which is that we don't have any time because we're all hypnotized by I'm one of those people. I could be in one of those tests where every 15 minutes I check my non-existent, update on something or other. But the other side is that there's an informality and a return to a kind of personal, a use of images, of links, all of which I really like. And so I've really enjoyed the switch to the blog. And what we're going to do now is switch over to the blog. And so the first post, I'll just read the first part, which you can see yourself. So if that's annoying, you can tell me. So the premise was that I would go out into New York and look for art that I loved. As my editor at Duke said, well, that lasted about 2 weeks, and then I went back to my usual critical tone. But I've fallen in love with many more artworks than I have men, and without giving anything away, I'd have to say that I've had better luck with the artworks I've loved, and even the ones I've hated. No painting I've ever seen was married, or loved someone else, or got in the way of my need for independence or solitude. And if I've tired of a work, having taken from it all that I needed and then outgrown it, the parting has always been amicable, with the possibility of hooking up always open to me. Meanwhile, and you can fill in the personal analogy or not, I pay a lot of attention to works I really dislike and get a lot of energy for my own work as a result. So that was what what this blog was going to be about. And occasionally, I do write about things that I love, but the critical voice takes over. However, one of the things that's been really fun, and I can just point to this post and suggest that you take a look at it. Blogs offer you the opportunity to do something that in a text you have to do in an indirect way. You can describe a film, you can quote a book, you can describe a painting, but you can't run the film in the book. But in a blog, if you can find it on YouTube, you can stick it into the blog, and you can show someone something. So it's been really fun to write about film. The frustrating part of that is that this post, somebody had to shoot Liberty Valance, which is about a John Ford movie that I thought was a really interesting analogy to some of the problems that I have with President Obama, and that, sort of wanting him to shoot Liberty Valance, who's this horrible villain supported by land barons in the West. Anyway, it was really fun to write, and I was able to set up through film clips how certain scenes are filmed from one side, then the other, how the diegesis works. And unfortunately, I don't go over these that often. Half of it has been taken offline since. So there are constant changes on YouTube as to whether something is available or not. And that's very frustrating. But it is a lot of fun. What I've done after 2 years, obviously a year of positive thinking was kind of a notional, thing, aspirational or symbolic. I've continued to do it for 4 years, so the year passed, and there was a sort of question: okay, do I keep going? Yeah, I keep going. I've got a blog. So there's tons. Like, to show you the blog is like to show you a gigantic octopus. There's just so much on it. And blogs have, tags. There's archives. But I have to say that the blog has something wonderful about it, the format or the web, which is that everything is always there until it's de-archived, which, by the way, does happen with blogs and websites. But people tend not to look through that. Every month I get I can check it every day if I was crazy, and there's no reason to do it, but you can check your analytics, and once a month I get a report on my Google Analytics, which I don't fully understand, but basically it'll tell you how many people looked at your blog, how much time they spent. Boy, is that scary. 1 minute is an eternity on the web. It's usually under a minute. And then there's this thing called bounce rate, which is, if I understand correctly, it's whether they just look at one page and then leave. And it's an 88% bounce rate. So they're not going through the blog. So through the archives and all the material that's there, so what I've done is I've created a kind of annotated table of contents, so that if somebody is coming, and I sent an email out and I posted it and blah, 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 so that someone could, if they're interested in painting, they can look at what posts are on painting. If they're interested in feminism, they can look at that. And things are cross-posted because they appear in more than one place. So in a way, books are better because they're always there and they have a kind of gravitas to them. On the other hand, blogs, or the web, offers you the opportunity to intervene instantly into the news cycle. And I did not write to the news cycle before. Mostly, meaning was not connected to, whether there was a biennial or all the things that Art Forum is completely hooked into. But there is a temptation, once you have something like this, to not just write speculative essays or some idea, which I do, you can kind of see it, but to respond to something that happens. And so I've written actually about that one of the sections in this is conditions of blog writing, or conditions of writing. As you can see, it's endless, endless, endless. Teaching, film, craft and process, conditions of, so in the Imperium of Analytics, for example, I talk about some of the issues involved with being in that news cycle. Because it's a space that is mine, I've also hijacked it for my own devices, and I feel that that's what I've done. In not this past summer, but the summer of 2013, I became interested in the fact, or in marking the fact, that I've worked in the same studio in the summer. I have this kind of cyclical studio practice, so that in the summer I do most of my work, in the winter I do writing, teaching, sort of being out in the world. And then I can go deeply into my painting in the summer, and I decided that I would select works that I had dated from different years, so like July, in this case, July 30th. And, what was I doing in 1982? And then what was I doing in 2012? And so I made a master list. I was not going to write for every day. I didn't have images on my hard drive for every day. And then I would just see what my current work would determine would be the subject of that day. So each had a particular subject. This, spinning off this work, the work has to be an expression of who I am right this minute, which was what I was doing that day in 2013. I talked about my own practice in relation in a way to that critique that I had been trying to address, the one of objectivity during the era of the death of the author. And so it was, I just feel like it's hard it's hard to know. What time is it, Jen? Okay, so I'm pointing to this rather than reading it, and but maybe I'll read something from one of the other posts, which was one of the later ones of August 24th. And as you can see, I have a work from 76, dated August 24th, 76, and which talks about Persephone, which sets up this kind of relation that I had of summer and winter, fertility and lack of ability to work creatively. The fact that I, for many summers, shared this house with my mother also added to the Persephone, Demeter kind of legend. And Persephone didn't want to go back to hell, but who knows, maybe she did. And so let's see. This is perhaps, in a way, a good place to end this part, and then we'll have time for questions, because it brings me up to a particular moment, although it's a year ago. And so I will read it. I would not give up visual pleasure for theory, even this summer when, through this retrospective process of considering works made on specific summer days over decades, I've begun to think of the period during which theory most influenced me, from the early 80s until the turn of this decade, as a period of the sacrifice of one part of my character as an artist, a period that perhaps is over, although there is still a professional imperative to keep up with whatever the Academy wants to apply its method, language, doxa, and rewards to. But I also know that it's ridiculous to claim that this was a sacrifice, since it was also my character and my desire that drove me. Even in the period I think of now as the dream period, which was the period before I started to work with, to write and address critical theory as best I could, I was involved in it with a feminist critique of power and the politics of changing the canon of American modern art. There was never a moment that was not text or history-based and politically engaged. I've always sought out the artwork and the theory that was seemingly most antithetical to my own practice, because it seemed necessary to keep the work from lapsing into solipsism and sentimentality. I will not give up the critical and intellectual or the visual and intuitive. So I see that the task ahead is to continue to insist that both ways of being as an artist can and even must exist in the same works and in the same practice. So like Persephone, I do live in two worlds. Often, as in the 1976 drawing, the duality is borne out in the two-sidedness of the drawing. And this summer, I have found myself making paintings that are reversible. The space is divided by a horizontal median line where the chthonic meets the surface of the earth and the air above. But the painting can be viewed with the chthonic below or above, because thinking of the opening line of Atsumori, which is a Japanese poem, which is the dream world, the country, the ground, and the summer, or the city and winter? So, I do have more to talk about, but why don't we have some questions, then I may show you one more aspect that's current right now to my writing. If Jen had some ideas that she wanted to talk about.
So I have to start with a question, because it's almost miraculous how much you reiterated something that Holland Cotter said last week. Did anyone here see him speak last week? Right, another talk in this series just a week ago. You just parroted him, right? What did he said, artists, the last question of the night was, can someone be an artist and a writer?
Yeah.
And he said, nope, ultimately you just have to make a choice. And it was so quick.
Thank you, Holland. I will get back to him on that.
And that's a wrap. The night was over. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that kind of resistance, and maybe talk not just about sort of, how the art world responds to that duality, but also how, just practically speaking, because my best thought for what he was saying was, you can't do both comprehensively. I was hoping that's what he meant, right? But how you do both, just, logistically, in your, how you balance the two, whether just working with a lot of RISD students, there's this kind of moving between the two forms feels sometimes very rough. It's a rough bridge from one to the other. So other reflections on the kind of negotiation or navigation between the two?
Well, as I said, people are very threatened by people who can do two things well, and they therefore want you to say that you can either do only one or say that you do only one. But I felt, just before I get to how I do it, the mechanics of how to do both at the in one lifetime, or in one practice. When I was last year of high school, I was in a French school, and we prepared for the baccalaureate. We had there was like a period of at-home study for this intensive 2-day written exam, and then later an oral exam. And so there was a lot of memorization, and it's very tedious. And I developed, not knowing about right brain, left brain, I developed a way to keep myself sort of alert, which was that I would study for a half an hour or an hour. Then I would do a jigsaw puzzle. And it was very restful, and then I could go back to study. So I was using both sides of my brain. And when I started to write, then I became a serious artist, for one thing, even though I think the work I did earlier was very important. But in a sense, I was using everything that I could, that I was given, and why on earth would one not do that? And why is it okay for Saul LeWitt to be a good writer, but not Mira Schor be a good writer and an artist at the same time. For me, it's like, okay, so two things, that's totally possible. I'm at home in the studio. Either I can't paint all day. I paint and then I read, and I paint and then, in fact, now I'll switch back to oh, that was a bad thing to do. Anyway, we'll get back to it. What was I looking for? I was going to go to, sorry.
That's it, actually. I think that's the PowerPoint right now.
I'm in the PowerPoint, and I need to go, I'm just going to zip past. Anyway, I can go, well, here's a day in the life of Mira Schor. I'm lying in Provincetown, Massachusetts, reading Michel de Certeau's The Practice of Everyday Life, and I have several notebooks next to me, one in which I do what I call parallel writing. In other words, I'm not necessarily writing about what I'm writing in the margins of the book, I'm writing something else that occurs to me, and I'm doing sketches. And some of what I'm sketching is what I'm reading in the book. I look up and there are birds in the trees, and the birds in the trees suggest talk balloons. I run in, I do a drawing from the words that I've just read in the book, and then I have a painting, and then I write a text. Those things flow smoothly together. Or I work for 2 weeks on painting, and then I work for a week on writing. The third thing is the problem, which is making a living, because I don't make a living from either painting or writing. In fact, I don't really make a living in a way. But I mean, in other words, it's always been the third thing. It's the thing that takes me out of the house that is the problem, not the dual ability to be both a writer and an artist. To me, that's easy. And honestly, sometimes I think, well, okay, which one could I live without? And I don't really see, I mean, I hope I don't ever have to choose. And there are times where I think, well, I could do without writing. But I think, well, I can't really do without writing, because I used to write letters to people. I'm always going to be writing until I'm senile. Or maybe then I'll still be writing, who knows. And then I think, well, maybe I could do without painting, but I can't really do without painting, because it's one of the deepest, deepest pleasures. And it's not like happy pleasure. It's like a deep, deep place that I go to when I paint, which gives me something when it starts to click, which nothing else does. Similarly, as much as I'm interested in all kinds of visual art, there's something about a painting when it is a good painting that gives me something that is invaluable. I can't really express what it is, which is why I mostly write negative things, because it's so hard to, or critical things, because it's so hard to express what that thing is that's given. In Figureground, I feel I do. So that's really how it works. So the difficulty is in doing all of it, not doing the part that matters, but the part where the world asks you to do things that are, maybe are related to what you're interested in, but they're not the thing, those major practices. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I just had a question, not about the dual practice of writing and painting, but about maybe about two kinds of writing. I was very interested in what you said about the whitelist and being whitelisted, and writing the essay about David Sally and it not being referred to in print for 20 years. And that really resonated. But then at the same time, it seemed that your writing practice, once initiated, moved very quickly, and that you were publishing immediately and went from strength to strength. So my question was, were there enclaves where you could publish, or were there two different kinds of writing, one which you could publish and one which you could not publish?
That's an interesting question. I think that, well, first of all, I established my own writing space. So that, it's really amazing how you create a little bit of real estate and people actually think it's real estate, and it can be like a hole in the ground. I mean, meaning couldn't have been more anonymous when it started, but we were part of the art world, in a modest way, and did create a community, and it did go out. And the thing is that magazines need material. You'd think that walls of galleries need artwork, but it doesn't work exactly the same way. And there are not that many artists who are articulate, so that there was a response to it, and there were enclaves, people who were interested in feminism. Those few women, when I wrote for Art Forum, which I did in the late 80s, early 90s, Ida Penicelli was the editor, and she assigned me Ida Applebrug and the Guerrilla Girls, and then allowed me to do some other things, wrote about Mary Kelly, and so that was an enclave at the top, but it came from another, an outside non-mainstream, if you think of feminism as non-mainstream. Oddly enough, in recent years, I've been asked to write for Art Forum again. To me, it comes completely out of the blue. But over a 30-year period, I guess I've built up a certain kind of reputation, actually of being fair, which is kind of interesting. And so I was asked to write something really kind of overwhelming. I was asked to write essentially the obituary, the kind of critical obituary of Hilton Kramer and Robert Hughes, two men who would have been, at least one of them would have been appalled at the idea of someone like me being the person, and I felt a tremendous responsibility to them. But when I got the query to do it from an editor, a person I'd never met at Art Forum, one of the editors at Art Forum, I wrote back and said, "God, this is the weirdest. I can't believe you've why me?" And it was like, because you will be fair, and I was fair because they wanted me to. I shouldn't really say this, but in a way they wanted me to slam them more than I did, because I delved deeply into as much as I could in a short time. I pulled like senior citizen I shouldn't put it that way, but I was basically pulling all-nighters for about 6 weeks in order to write this thing. And I don't know, I'll ever do anything like that again. But that was, that was really interesting. So, and I write a lot. I was going to show writings that I've done in the Brooklyn Rail. And that's because that's part of one lives in circles in the art world, and circles overlap. And somehow I'm connected to the Brooklyn Rail Circle, which is an interesting journal. And so it's not the art world that you think of when you look at Art Forum, the part where I would be included as an artist, let's say. But it's not the art world that you think of, or when you see the market, But there are many art worlds. And they interlace, and in that way, yes, I did find enclaves of respect. It's more that where I addressed my criticism or my critical views, those did not answer directly. But there were many people who were happy to read what I had written, because they were looking for some out, painters. When they read Figureground, it was like, okay, here is somebody who's telling me that I can continue painting, and what some of the issues are of the critique of painting, So, there was that. Oh, okay. And then there's someone in the front.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So in the light of your comment about the whitelisting, I found that like a really foreign idea, but something that was like really striking, because I couldn't see that happening nowadays, just because with the advancement of like technology, and you have the internet as a platform where basically what you want to say or any ideas can be democratized, and you don't need an institution to justify what you're saying. And your little bit of real estate can become even, less of an opportunity cost, because, you could just open up a blog site and everyone's a self-publisher. So in the light of that, I was wondering if you had comments about how someone who were to write critically or to write speculative essays would approach, or the differences between what the problems you faced and the problems we of the internet
Right,
would
right.
face, especially since you have been staying current and have your own blog and like, you know.
First of all, in the larger culture, I think there still is a whitelist. If you look at the range of news coverage, leaving at the edges, Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! on one side and Fox News on the other, and everything else in between, so much is not covered. So many voices, intelligent, articulate, informed voices are simply never heard. So that's a form of whitelist also. And, but yes, everyone can start. And I think one of my students, Tatiana Istomina, who is a painter, and for whom English is not her first language, started a blog last year called Metaleptic Stories. And she just started it and sent it around, posts it on Facebook. I haven't asked her how it's, spreading out for her, but she's a very good writer. And I think, well, she started that little space, and creating that little space for herself. So if she continues it, it will build. She might end up with the same track and some of the same issues that I've dealt with, which is she may be asked to write for, more established mainstream journals at a certain point, or she may be given certain opportunities. I think she is doing it partly as an accompaniment to her visual work. There may be a career as, nobody's it's totally human to hope that you create something. Again, you're creating discourse around yourself. So I think that, one starts, it's just like how does that ripple effect continue? And I do think that a single voice rippling out can have an effect. So I do feel strongly about that. Some of the issues I'm talking about, though, I think are still present. And also I'm talking about maybe my goals may be a little different than yours, in that I probably still do, or it's sort of transparent from what I've said, that I do care about those mainstream or authoritative voices, because they matter. They actually dispose of power. And after being an artist for over 40 years, I would like to have some, one can't help but want some validation from a system that you've lived in, however critically, for that period. And that may be different, in and I didn't start, I don't know what it would have been like if at age 23 I had started a journal with a friend. I mean, we may have had a completely different approach. And if I were younger now, I'm sure my relation to working on the web would be different, because I would have more abilities to do things myself. I'd love to, for example, I'd love to be Sister Wendy, basically. I'd like to do little like 5-minute movies, and I just don't know how to do it myself. I don't know how to create something and then put it, turn it into something that can go online, blah, blah, blah. The learning curve is too steep for me to pick up all the things that I think if I were in my 20s, I would just know or learn very easily, or have friends who could do. So.
Would you collaborate with someone who was younger and able to?
I've thought about it. Yeah, I've thought about it. I don't want to get into a situation where I'm exploiting somebody, or where it's where it's more me than a collaboration. But I feel like some of the things that I'm doing have a collaborative element with new generations of editors and writers, like at the Rail. So, yeah.
My question had to do with your blog and with the editorial process, because you spoke a lot about working with editors on your books. Do you have an editor for the blog, or someone who sees your posts before you write them?
No. but there are two things. One, it helped to have had editors all those years. The other, and two, practically speaking, in order for it to go out to my subscribers, I have to hit publish. If I want it to go out on a particular day, I have to hit publish by about 6 o'clock in the evening. So sometimes I'll just write all day. I hit publish, and then I start to see all of the typos and all of the stuff, and then I'm like madly trying to correct them before it actually, the feed goes out, because there's about an hour in there where I'm safe. And it is different. I mean, it's different. And the pieces that I've done for the Rail they're pretty eccentric, but they're, but some of them have been edited in ways that were minute but useful. And so it certainly was a learning experience to have very thorough editors in an earlier period. So I would say that I taught myself to edit myself. However, if a text is in some way controversial, and I feel I do send it to friends often before who are very kind and will read it. You know, sometimes they'll read it in time for me to adjust it, or I'll wait to get a sense of what they think. And it's also, that's a little bit like sonar. It's like I may not take their advice, but it helps me to see the piece better.
And my other question related to your blog was, how long do you plan? Do you have a plan for how long you intend to write? Are you writing as much as you did when you started? And
no, I don't write as much as I did when I started. So sometimes a couple of months will go by, and I do consider, sometimes something will come up, like the Matisse exhibition, and I haven't decided yet whether I have something to add to everything that everyone's saying about it. So maybe I will, or maybe I won't. But every once in a while I feel the necessity. I also have used it. You know, once you have a space, it's very tempting. I didn't mention a couple of other things that I do, which is occasionally, I feel like my Facebook timeline is like a secondary blog where I'll write something much more informal, a paragraph. If there's a really interesting response, and sometimes there will be, I'll ask for permission to republish that on the blog. So then the two kind of go, back and forth. And I've also published, I don't want to do this regularly, but it was very tempting. I wrote something about Anna Mendieta and the efforts to restore the reputation of Carl Andre last spring, and the response was intense. And her dealer made me aware of letters that had been written to the New Yorker against a profile of Carl Andre a year before, which I had remembered and brought up. And I said, well, may I see the letters? And these were from Anna Mendieta's sister and her dealer in London. And I said, well, these are amazing. Could I publish them? And they said, yes. So I published them. Then that led to a panel discussion, a radio show. It kind of spread out. And there was a performance piece that was done, a demonstration. So it has its uses. It has a flexibility. And I use it to write, in a sense, drafts of a major project that I'm working on my family's artwork, like a cultural autobiography, which, again, I feel like I'm kind of hijacking my blog. If you went to it today, you would see the most recent post was a very brief piece about my sister, Naomi Schor, who used to teach at Brown and was the founder of Differences Journal. But there may come a time where I don't do it, or I switch to doing something else. I don't know. And I'll try to keep it online so that it remains. It's cheap enough to do that, so that it remains there.
I wanted to ask you about this idea of feared goo, and whether you think painting is somehow perpetually maintaining this status of the feared goo, or whether there's a new kind of 2014 feared goo, or if maybe this whole thing has been assimilated and now there is no kind of medium left to fear. How do you think about that in today's terms?
Well, I'd love to know what the feared goo of 2014 is. Ebola, right. That's an interesting question. I think that, and like many things, everything is true at the same time. So there's a lot of painting being done. You could say that whether or not those critics that I termed aesthetic terrorists felt that way, painting continued, and in all types of painting. But in certain areas of art, the critique of painting is pretty powerful, and there is an element of disgust to it, although it's never articulated really. But there's a dematerialization. There's an interest in a kind of dematerialization or a very clean kind of art. There's an essay that I can't quite put together yet, which would basically be about the influence of IKEA on installation art. There's a certain kind of clean look. You go into a gallery, there's like a clean Parsons table or wooden table or trestle, and then there's some books on it, and maybe there's a video, and so the base materialism is not really favored, and if you're going to get to it, you have to have had a good theoretical basis for having gotten to it before you engaged in the base materialism. You don't look at the artworks that were done, or you don't think of your personal history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I have quite a bit of contact with an area of thought that would still deeply, I think, underneath is afraid of that goo. Yes.
Any last questions?
Faith has a question.
Yeah, thank you. I've been looking at your
Voice and
painting
speech.
up there, and just thinking, as an artist who also writes, but also does really different kind of art than painting. I'm talking about myself now. I'm empathizing a lot with, with that supposedly problem of jumping back and forth from these different registers. But I'm thinking, like when you do something like this, when you're making this, is the critical voice speaking? Do you have to silence anything in yourself in order to allow yourself to keep going?
Which critical voice, do you think? The self-critical voice?
Well, I remember early on in the feminist art program, we talked about sort of the male forbidding voice that we were always hearing in our head, that Virginia Woolf writes about in To the Lighthouse. Women can't paint, women can't write. While Lily is trying to put her tree in the middle of her painting, and so she keeps hearing that voice. You can't put the tree in the middle of the painting. That just isn't done. So just thinking about, and I still have that experience of
hearing that voice in your head.
the critical, it's a slightly different voice, but it's still a very critical voice. And so I'm just wondering if you have that experience.
I don't think so when I'm working. Maybe that's why I need art making so much. Because when I'm actually making it, then I'm certainly not hearing that. I'm not hearing the phallic voice telling me that I'm doing the wrong thing. If I'm more likely to turn that critical voice on, in that I've spent so much time trying to understand the other, my other, that I can actually end up taking that other side against myself, but in a more general sense, not so much when it's my painting itself. So when I'm actually painting, I'm painting, and I'm really in a world, in a space that is not, I don't think I'm being affected by that. I mean, I do wonder what kind of art I would have, it's hard, it's like impossible to sort out what I would have done thinking of what I was doing in the 80s, if the 80s hadn't happened, if the ideas in which I had come of age had continued to be viable in a major way. And many artists did continue without feeling that they had to have any responsibility to that critique. But I was situated, perhaps even socially situated, in terms of friends, networks, et cetera, that I felt I couldn't do that. And that's what that last paragraph that I read was about, where it's really hard for me to sort out. But when I'm painting, and I'm not thinking. But like this, I brought it back to this painting, because this painting is about the oppression. It's about the oppression of doxa, it's very white and dry. It's that aesthetic that I'm talking about. And then underneath is this figure, and it's a very embodied, dry pigment, oil. It's barely there. It's very raw in the real of this work. And so which one is it? Is doxa down or up? But then I'm doing it in the painting, so that makes it's a way of dealing with it, which is not the same as not doing the painting, because doxa told me I shouldn't do the painting. So
Okay. Thank you, Mira, so much.
thank you for inviting me.